My friends often say to me, "Hey Mark, how can we read classics like you do?" That's not true, of course. My friends never say that. I don't think a friend's ever said that to me in my life, not face to face. Now, a couple of very kind viewers have said in the comments similar types of questions, and of course, I'm not an expert, but I'm more than happy, as usual, to give my 2 cents worth as to how at least I came to read the classics and how I like to read classics as at least my favourite form, probably these days, of fiction. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, Book Time with Elvis with me, Mark. And I hope so much you're doing very well. Now, I'm not an expert. I'm not an academic. And also, the word classic itself is often full of, well, let's say open to debate for some people. I made a video recently about 5 short classics, and while one viewer graciously granted me 2 of the books as being classics, they kindly pointed out that 3 of the others were not. However, I maintain that if a publisher publishes them as part of their classics range, then they are, to all intents and purposes, to the world, considered a classic, at least somewhere, probably. I mean, I will maintain till my last breath that Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome is very much a classic. Certainly, if you can include other works in such, describe other works as being such, then why not? Why not that? Why not that? But, it can be very much down to the individual, perhaps, as to what they might consider a classic. I think obviously a classic has to have some age to it, probably. But again, I'm no expert. I'm no doctor of literature or anything like that. So I can only give you the broad definition as I Google it, I suppose. As to what makes a classic a classic, and I think I have done a video on that as well. But again, it's only my opinion, really, or at least maybe a commonly held opinion as to what makes a classic a classic. But a lot of people find themselves very intimidated by classics, and perhaps, there is some justification in that. It can be daunting embarking on a classic work of literature. I mean, certainly it can be daunting embarking on a classical work of literature. Anything by Greeks or Romans, you might think, oh my goodness, that's impossible. But then you have to remember, of course, those works are, for most people, translated. You're not likely to be reading it in ancient Greek or Latin. And although it does sometimes feel that the translations themselves are old-fashioned, and they may well be, because I guess the bulk of this body of work were translated at the beginning of the last century and before, that in itself might be cause for intimidation for some people, getting through the kind of academic and archaic language that certain literary professors or classics professors from the great universities chose to employ whilst translating those works. But there are, of course, exceptions. I mean, you can read Herodotus, you can read it by I would say all 3 versions that I've read, I've really enjoyed. Aubrey de Selincourt's version, it's the classic one for the Penguin Black Spine range. You have, I think, Robin Waterfield does it for Oxford World Classics, it's also very good. And even Tom Holland's newer translation may not be to everybody's taste, but it certainly makes it more readable and more open to a wider audience, perhaps. His version brought out in the Penguin Classics Deluxe range, which you can find there. Now, should you be intimidated by the classics? Was I intimidated by the classics? In my own case, no, I wasn't particularly, because I would say my introduction to them was probably the same as a lot of yours, without trying to be any kind of patronizing or anything like that, is that, I first came across the classics in any serious capacity at school. But of course, we all, or at least people my age, would have grown up watching films that were based on classics. I mean, people today still watch Disney films based off classic fairy tales and things like that. One of my favorite films as a small child was Treasure Island. And because I loved the film, I wanted to read the book. And I was quite young at first, so I had the book read to me. And then I went off and read it myself, and I read it every couple of years since. The same can be said for Sherlock Holmes as well, Now, there is obviously, the topic itself can be quite wide. I mean, if you're including, when I want to include works like 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, or Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle in the same breath as the same grouping as works like perhaps George Eliot's Middlemarch or Jane Austen, for example, and her works. I mean, there is difference. There's difference in literary style and perhaps quality of literature, but I like to measure things more, not in how literary something is, but how much I enjoy it, which again shows my lack of academic qualifications there, right? Because I don't really care. As long as the book is enjoyable, the language is enjoyable to me, that I find it enjoyable. But an English professor might say, oh, that's a load of rubbish. I don't care. So I came to classics, I suppose, first through things like film and having them read to me and this kind of thing. And then I would go off and read easy ones, children's ones by myself. And of course, that's something that, I would say probably a lot of you experienced as well. You may not have followed up on it, but it doesn't stop you now from using easier children's classics to ease yourself into reading. I mean, I have no problem even today reading children's classics. This is an Oxford children's classic of The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. It's a fantastic book, and it's just as fun and enjoyable for adults as it is for children. But as it was written for children, I think it works as a good gateway into getting into the works of Charles Dickens, of Rudyard Kipling, right? And then once you get into his style, it will open the door for you to find other types of classic authors from perhaps that era. Now, definitely, this is extremely intimidating. You do have to learn another language to be able to read it in its original. You can't just pick up a copy of Beowulf and read it. You do need to study Old English in order to do so. But there are, again, a lot of nice translations of this work which will enable you to read it. Now, sometimes reading works in verse can be not to everybody's taste. But again, it's not a bad starting point. If you're going to pick up and read an epic in verse, Beowulf is not a bad starting point. As long as you don't have to worry about understanding the Old English and you can read it in translation, it's probably a good setup before you jump into something larger like the Aeneid or the Odyssey or the Iliad or something like that, right? You get used to it, or even if you perhaps head off onto trying Paradise Lost by Milton and whatnot. I think everything has some kind of gateway. Now, you might not agree with me. You may have your own way. I can only talk about my own experiences, is that I start with something either that I'm aware of, I'm already interested in, or somebody I trust has absolutely recommended that I pick it up. Nobody is saying you should just blindly pick up even, let's say, the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. If you're going to read it in its original, it will come as a shock to you if you've never come across Chaucer before. It's written in Middle English. It takes time to decipher it. You need lots of footnotes and things like that to help you get through it. But get through it you can. I was extremely lucky. I had a teacher at school who was kind of expert, really, in the Canterbury Tales, and that helped enormously, and it instilled in me a love for them that I am happy to pick them up from time to time and dip in and out of them and read them and enjoy them. And I think it also goes for a lot of people with Shakespeare. It's not everybody's idea of an easy read. Now, most of us come into contact with Shakespeare through school, and unfortunately we're introduced to him at a time where perhaps most of us couldn't care less, really. He's not necessarily speaking to every single 13-year-old who first comes into contact with Shakespeare. So you may have that contact at school, and depending on how good your teacher was, how interesting and involved your lessons were, you may have just written off Shakespeare after school and have no wish to go back. But that's a mistake, I would say. Give it a go. Start easy. Watch the plays. Watch along. Read along. There are so many plays out there on YouTube. If you don't want to go to the theatre, or you can't get to the theatre, or there's nothing like that near where you are, you can watch. The internet is just full of resources to help you read Shakespeare, to help you read Chaucer. If you're curious about how to pronounce the Middle English and things like that, you can learn how to properly read the Shakespeare plays too, and the right accents and intonations that you should be using if you just look it up on YouTube. It's a shame that people have this fear and this intimidation from these great works, because, to be honest, you're missing out. And given the choice for me, I would actually much rather pick up this, even though I'm not a massive fan of Shakespeare. I appreciate him, and I find, that the work can be beautiful, but it's not my go-to. But I would still go to this probably before I would go to a lot of the stuff that's published today. Now, that's fun, and that might be your taste, and that's absolutely fine. But as I say, so many people do wonder and worry about how to approach the classics. And as I said before, the only thing I can do is tell you how I do it, and that's to have no fear of it. No fear of it. I mean, they are just words on a page. You open up, you start reading, you might not get it the first time or the second time, but by the fifth time, you probably will. And if you use other resources to help you, then you do it, and it opens up another world to you, which I think is just fantastic. And another thing with classics I find that people worry about is the size. They get extremely intimidated by the size of some of them, and I can understand that. I mean, if you're going to pick up Les Miserables, it's a brick. It's a brick. Now, the interesting thing with the size, especially if you pick up a book in translation, is the quality of the translation, how readable that is. Now, in the case of Les Miserables, I've only read this version, and it's the newest translation of this work, but it was wonderful. This is such a wonderful book, and everybody should read it, but they think, oh, it's 1,400 pages, that's impossible. Of course, nobody thinks twice about reading 300 pages book maybe in a month or two. So, there's no rush. Just take it as if it were 5 separate books or 3 separate books or whatever. The translation, I think, makes it a bit easier. Sometimes the more modern the translation, if you're not used to reading classic works, can be a benefit, even if the work itself is older than another classic. So translation is very important. If you're reading a Victorian, Charles Dickens is somebody who generally I find I have to read about 30 pages to get into, but I always seem to somehow get into him, right? But it's never just an easy, slotting into how he writes and his style after you've been reading other things. It does take a little bit of time, but this is easier, because the translator has written it in the last, say, 5-6 years, I can't remember exactly, and in a more modern style. So you're not reading, it's like, I live here in the Czech Republic, and Czechs read Shakespeare in their Czech or in their literature lessons, right? But they're not reading it like English school kids are forced to read it in early modern English with unfamiliar words. They're reading a work in translation. And it all depends on how modern or not that translation is. And I don't think, from what I know, that those editions of Shakespeare are translated into Czech by authors from the late Victorian, early 20th century who are trying to mimic Czech that was spoken at the time of Shakespeare. They're doing it in the language of the day. So again, it's that much easier, and your approach to it is going to be that much different. Don't be put off by reading a work in translation. Perhaps if you're not used to it, go for a more modern translation. And don't be put off by the size. Because I can tell you, this book, the very good Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, is not really my cup of tea. I find this harder to read than this. And I'm sure I'm not alone. I mean, look at the difference, right? This looks much easier, but it takes, for me at least, it takes much, much longer to get into. And I find my head hurts more reading this than reading this. Okay, it's perhaps personal taste. I'm not maybe a big fan of her style. But the thing is as well, is to find the type of book that interests you. Start off with the kids' books. Start off with the fun adventure novels, the Sherlock Holmeses, things like that. Get used to the language and then either work your way backwards or whatever to get to the type of classic literature that that's for you. I'm sure all of us will have some classic work that we will love. We just have to find the right one. That's all I can say, really. Again, it's all just my own experience, what I think, it's my opinion. I'm not coming at it from any official or academic standpoint. I mean, that's all I can do is just impart my own experience with reading such books to you. And if you have any feedback, of course, as to how you got into the reading so-called classics, or if you're new to them, or if you're an old hand, let me know all your comments down below in the relevant field. Thank you ever so much for watching. I just want to thank my wonderful patrons you see flashing up on the screen there behind me. And of course, should you wish to join them, there is a link down below and you can have a week's free trial. And hopefully you'll enjoy it. Okay, take care everybody. All the best. Bye bye.